Hello, I'm Dan Gibson and welcome to the fourth video in the series, The Qibla Story. Now, if you have not seen the first three videos in this series, please find them and watch them first, as this video may not make a lot of sense without listening to the first videos. Now, today we want to address the question of what I call the parallel mosques. These mosques are all in North Africa and Spain. The Qiblas of these mosques do not face Mecca in Saudi Arabia, nor do they face Petra in Jordan, as all of the mosques in the first years of Islam did. They also do not face the between position begun by General Hajjaj, the son-in-law of Caliph al-Walid. The between Qiblas ended soon after Hajjaj died. 30 years later, not a single mosque was constructed towards the between position. Some 80 years later, Al-Kanani al-Basri wrote in his book Rasa'il Jahiz, "The setting of the between Qibla is among the misdeeds of Caliph Walid I and his family." Now, all of the between mosques were built in a 66-year period. Later, al-Walid and his family were seen as the fault for bringing this teaching into Islam. Not just his immediate family, but his sons and others who ruled after him. This brought much shame to Muslims, that the between Qibla, it wasn't even discussed after this, and later writers would only talk about how bad the Umayyad caliphs were. So the supporters of the Petra Qibla dwindled, and it was only kept alive in China. But eventually it dwindled there too. The last we hear of it is a plaque being placed in China, which said that Islam started west of Mecca. We saw that plaque in the previous video. Now, something happened in North Africa, and as I went back and looked, I discovered it all began in Algeria. The oldest mosque in North Africa is known as the Sidi Ghanem Mosque. It is about 400 miles east of Algeria in the old city of Mila. Now, the city of Mila was originally a Roman city, and the Umayyad armies arrived around 59 AH after the Hijra, or 675 after AD, or in the Christian counting. They conquered the city under the command of Abu al-Muhajir ad-Dinar. And it seems that same year, the command was given to clear a spot near a Christian basilica and to construct a mosque. There were plenty of building materials, blocks and columns that could be taken from the basilica. But the mosque did not align with the Roman basilica, nor to the Roman city street plan, not that we can tell. This mosque has lots of symbolism. For instance, its 62-meter-high minaret was built with 365 steps, the number of days in a year. Now, this mosque was originally known as the Abu al-Muhajir Dinar Mosque, but later that name was stripped from the mosque, and it was given a rather obscure name, and it was just a local Fatimid imam whose name was Sidi Ghanem. His grave wasn't even in the city of Mila. It was in the city of Oran. Nevertheless, this mosque received his name. Abu al-Muhajir Dinar, who built the mosque, ended up with not even a mosque named after him. Now, we need to understand something about Abu al-Muhajir. He was originally a slave to Musalma ibn Mukhalid, a respected member of the Ansar, who gave him his freedom. When Musalma was appointed the governor of Egypt and Africa, he wanted to make Abu al-Muhajir the emir, or the general of the Arab forces. The two trusted each other and they worked together well. The biggest problem they faced was a man known as Uqba ibn Nafi of the Quraysh, who was already the general. You see, the Muslims had stopped advancing in North Africa, and they were just making raids into the Berber area, but they were no longer capturing any new territory. Abu al-Muhajir was instructed to deal fairly and quietly with General Uqba, but instead he put him in shackles and he threw him into prison. Then Abu al-Muhajir went about establishing himself in the city of Mila. He first built a headquarters, and then he set about organizing the expansion of the Muslim empire further west, taking land from the Berbers. He also started construction of a major mosque in Mila to honor himself, his own mosque. Now the Caliph in Damascus heard about Uqba being in prison, and he requested that he be released and sent to Damascus. When Uqba left, he saw Abu Muhajir, and he vowed to him to treat Abu Muhajir as he had been treated. During Uqba's time in Damascus, a new caliph was elected, and Yazid came to power, and he restored Uqba as the general, and gave him some troops, a few troops, and he sent him back. And so the first thing he did, this is in 682, he arrives back, so he puts General Abu al-Muhajir into chains. But he doesn't put him in prison. He forces him to accompany him wherever he went. Now the next year, Uqba's forces were ambushed by the Berber chief. His name is Qusayla. And Uqba is said to have offered to unchain Abu al-Muhajir so that he could have a better chance in the fight. But Abu al-Muhajir said that he would rather die fighting wearing his chains. In the end, both men were killed in this battle. So Uqba is buried in Algeria in the Al-Shurafa cemetery with 300 other soldiers from the battle. So we have two Qiblas here to consider in this story. The first is Abu al-Muhajir's mosque back in Mila, and the second is the mausoleum or the graveyard for Uqba, the graveyard that's outside that mausoleum in the Shurafa cemetery. So actually there's three things we're going to look at. The orientation of Abu al-Muhajir's mosque in Mila, it's not obvious. There is a plan for the building, and here it is. You can see how the building was constructed. It started out as a mosque, but in the end it ceased being a mosque and it was converted into a workshop and later into a hospital. Now here's the general plan of the mosque, of the entire building. Now we have a problem with the orientation of this mosque. Which wall is the Qibla wall? Is it the wall on the right that faces Petra? A Petra Qibla is 95.65 degrees. This wall faces 97.68 degrees, so it's only about 2 degrees off, which is average for this time for Petra Qibla. So it seems that the mosque was oriented towards Petra. And it's in the time period when all mosques faced Petra. It's still 28 years before Hajjaj builds his mosque, and it obviously doesn't face Mecca. And so it started out right about the time that the Second Islamic Civil War started. So they start building, and Ibn Zubair starts his war over here. So this war is taking on during the construction of this building. So we can assume that this mosque faced Petra, as indeed one of the walls does. But then something happened. The builders of the mosque seem to change their plans. Instead of using the east wall, they make the mosque longer, and they use the south wall as the Qibla wall. This Qibla makes no sense. It faces 187.68 degrees south. There's nothing out there. It doesn't line up with anything. Is it just faced off into Africa? So, look again. The orange part indicates the main entrance. The green part is the latrines. So not only did this mosque switch from Petra to a nebulous place, Abu al-Muhajir placed the latrines directly between his mosque and the new caliph in Damascus. Well, perhaps that explains why Abu al-Muhajir's name was stripped from this mosque, and it was renamed for a local imam, and then sometime later it was abandoned and used as a workshop. It is interesting that in the 9th century, not too far later, Islamic writers are very hard on Abu al-Muhajir. It seems they're still quite close to the events and things that are still a bit raw, so they make him out to be a small ruler who never went anywhere or did anything. But once we reach the 11th century, the Islamic historians are much kinder, and they acknowledge that not only was he the ruler of the army there, but that he expanded Islam all the way into Tunisia, and he established the army's presence there. Okay, that's Abu al-Muhajir's mosque. What about Uqba? But we do have the site of the battle where he died, and we have the mosque that was and the tomb there that was built, known as the Sidi Uqba Mosque. Let's check them out on the Qibla tool. Here we see the mosque is a very large modern building. We see that this mosque is classified, or I have classified it as unknown, as it was rebuilt in 416 after the Hijrah and again in 1214 after the Hijrah. This mosque today faces Mecca, and that's what we would expect of a modern building. It is also assumed that the body of Uqba is buried on this spot, and that one of the later renovators who were renovating the mosque orientated the mosque towards Mecca. Now, after Uqba's death, Commander Zuhair ibn Qais, who's the next commander, recommended a number of soldiers that had been captured. He said he got them to be released. He redeemed them, and then when they came back, he sent them to bury this general's body and to build a mosque. So the building was initially a very simple. It was entirely built out of cement, no stone. The mosque was renovated, as we said, several times, some of which records were lost and difficult to assess the exact date and the details. And some of the renovations were conducted, for instance, in 1025 AD under the rule of Al-Muazzid ibn Badis. According to an inscription inscribed in the mausoleum, a decorative door was added to the mosque in the 14th century, and another renovation was attributed to in 1789, and then another in the 1800s. But what is of interest is the graveyard where the battle took place. So we have no original mosque there that we can measure, but we do have the graveyard. And as one would expect, the graves, they should either face Petra or Mecca in the Muslim tradition. But the graves point southeast at 127.38 degrees. The tombs are all lined up, and they're still visible today, but the Qiblas of these tombs are all unique in the Muslim world, and so we have no idea what's going on. Well, what we do know is that 46 years later, as the Muslims pushed further west, a mosque was built in Tunis known as the Jamia al-Zaytunum Mosque, with a Qibla of 154.12 degrees. And then what follows what I call the parallel mosques. What is important to notice is that just before this, in 702, Hajjaj started building the between mosques. Petra was destroyed in a powerful earthquake then in 713, which I think would have helped Hajjaj promote his between position. Mecca was only just beginning to be accepted in Saudi Arabia. So what were these armies supposed to do? They had oriented their mosque, they have to orient their mosque in some direction, and so do they choose Petra, which is now being discounted by so many people? Do they choose Mecca, which is just coming up? I think they chose a Qibla that was unique to Africa. There already were two mausoleums that were using Qiblas that pointed to some spot in Africa. So it only makes sense that the Africans would pray to Africa, especially if they despised the rulers in Damascus at that time. And so a fourth Qibla, an African Qibla, was adopted. Now we will talk about this despising the caliphs in the next video. As I have found 7 mosques that orient from this time period. This is before the Muslim armies ever reached Spain. This is still in North Africa. They have chosen this Qibla. After the Muslim armies cross into Spain and after much of the fighting is settled down, the mosque rulers set about the construction of several magnificent Spanish mosques. True to form, they looked for a location that already had plenty of building material, already quarried and squared. Usually this took them to a Roman temple or a Christian church or basilica. So in Cordoba, the new Muslim government found a suitable building site and set about building a magnificent mosque. And they chose an African Qibla, just like they had been doing in North Africa. The Cordoba Qibla was at 157.12 degrees, close enough to the other Qiblas, easy to build as it followed the old foundation that was already on the site. It also had a secondary meaning. It was directly parallel to a line drawn between Petra in Jordan and Mecca in Saudi Arabia. This is why I have called this kind of Qibla the parallel mosques. Perhaps they should have been called the African mosques, but that name would not have identified their unique Qibla, as later Abbasid mosques in Africa all faced Mecca in Saudi Arabia. So there are more mosques in Africa. So it is parallel between Petra and Mecca, and that's a unique thing, and that's why I've called them that. Now, we have 11 accounts of what happened in North Africa and the move into Spain. And no two of them agree with each other. All of the accounts were written much later, much later, and they represent the many different Islamic factions in Spain known as Andalus. Now, in Andalus, in the history and the genealogies, they were all written in Arabic for the rulers of the new Islamic State, addressing certain issues that those rulers wanted addressed, and avoiding certain issues that the authors felt best to avoid, especially anything that would cast a shadow or some kind of shame on the ruler or on the religion of Islam. So in the end, each of the writers of early histories of Islam in Spain, they each had their own story. But we can find some common threads that go through all of these 11 histories. The first to arrive in Spain was Tariq ibn Zayed, who was described as a Berber and the leader of an army of Berbers. Tariq was a client ruler of the governor of North Africa, whose name was Musa ibn Nusayr, who had his headquarters in Cairon, and he was the man who, he was an Arab ruler. He had an Arab background, a very good Arab background. His father had been a member of the royal guard of Khalif Mawiyah, and when news of the first victories in Spain reached North Africa, more Berbers flocked to join Tariq, and Musa ibn Nusayr himself crossed the peninsula into Spain with a force of Arabs. So the Berbers were first, Arab army came second. Now, the 11 accounts of this period, out of them, only one it's a very early account, the 8th century. It's a Latin chronicle, which we know is the Chronicle of 754. It survives in a 10th century codex from northern Spain. Now, the Chronicle of 754 describes the conquerors as Arabs and Moors. It also mentions Arabs and Saracens. It is clear that the army contained two different ethnic groups. Another book, Book 9 of the Etymologies of Isidore, identifies these Saracens, and this is what it says about them. He says they're the descendants of Ishmael, the Arabs of Syria, they originated in the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula. There's no mention of the Arabs from Mecca. Chronicle of 754 speaks of the Maori and never uses the term Berber. Most of these histories speak of continual raids on Spain from Roman times, and one of these chronicles' predecessors, John of Beclair, he recorded about the Berber struggles against the Byzantines and the Roman rule. So back in 700 AD, the Romans were still seen as the great enemies of everyone in that area. The first years of occupation were given to conquest. Armies were faced, cities were attacked, land was taken, they moved forward, governing had to be established, and so forth. So the Arabs and the Berbers, they didn't always agree and get along, so there's no indication of mosque building done on Spanish land for the first 50 years of the occupation. I'm sure they did temporary things, but no major construction. But when they started, all of the mosques of Spain were similar to the mosques of North Africa. They all had some kind of African Qibla, even the graveyards. While they varied from 187 degrees to 114 degrees, the average Qibla over a 300-year period from Abu al-Muhajir's mosque in 678 until 978 was 152.5 degrees. And we have around 20 mosques in this time period in our database. And we'll add more as we can find more. So if you draw a line from Petra in the north of the and down to Mecca in the south in Arabia, the angle is 155 degrees. And if you look at the Kaaba building in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, you will realize that it is facing directly towards the Kaaba building in Petra. These are not coincidences. Mosque builders thought very carefully about their structures. However, when the Middle Ages came along, Petra, the between Qibla, and the parallel Qiblas, they seem to have been all forgotten. And the people in the Middle Ages wondered, why did they have those Qiblas? So in the next video, we will examine some of these ideas put forward during the golden age of Islam. So we have talked about the Petra Qibla, the Mecca Qibla, the between Qiblas. Today, the parallel Qiblas that are in Spain and North Africa. And next video, we are going to look at the medieval Qiblas, or at least the medieval explanations that were given of the Qiblas and why the medieval people thought all these various Qiblas existed before them. I'm Dan Gibson, and this has been another video in the series, The Qibla Story.